Suppose that somebody thinks that everybody in the world is trying to poison him. Right? So he doesn't go to a restaurant because he's afraid that the cook or the waiter will poison the food. He doesn't accept a drink at a party because he's afraid that whoever serves him the drink is gonna poison it before giving it to him. He even sort of, when he goes to the supermarket, maybe he takes like a bottle from the back of the shelf because he's afraid that some secret agent has been poisoning the front row bottles waiting for him to purchase one of them. What do we think about such a person? Well, we think that such a person is crazy. But why do we think that this person is crazy? The most obvious answer probably is we think that this person is crazy because he has these very wrong beliefs, right? He believes that everybody is trying to poison him, but it's not true that everybody is trying to poison him. So he has radically false beliefs, and that's what's so crazy about him. But maybe that's not the right way of thinking. Maybe that's not the right way to diagnose what is going on. In order to see that, imagine somebody who doesn't believe that everybody is trying to poison him. Why doesn't he believe this? Because he's done his research. So this person that I'm now imagining goes to the restaurant, and whenever he goes to the restaurant, he brings a suitcase in which he has a lot of chemical tests that he can use to test food and drink for cyanide and strychnine and all kinds of poisons. Right? So when his food is served, or when his glass of Merlot is served, right? He takes the Merlot and he puts it into all this scientific equipment, and okay, there's no cyanide in it, and okay, look, there's no strychnine in it, and there's no whatever in it, and he does the same with his food, and he comes to believe on the basis of the evidence that nobody in this restaurant is trying to poison him, and he happily eats his food and drinks his drink, and he does this all the time. And what's more, he meets me and he says, "Victor, I know you're not trying to poison me." And I say, "Yeah, sure. How do you know that I'm not trying to poison you?" And he says, "Oh, I've been reading your secret diary, and you never mentioned the desire to want to poison me." And I say, "What? You've been reading my secret diary?" And he says, Yeah, I was investigating the hypothesis that you were trying to poison me, and this seemed like the best evidence I could get. And so I checked out this evidence, and I reached the conclusion that you are not, in fact, trying to poison me." What do we think about this person? Well, I think what we ought to think about this person is that he is crazy. He is just as crazy as the paranoid person who believes that everybody actually does want to poison them. Right? There's no real difference in madness here between these two people, even though one believes that everybody wants to poison him and the other doesn't, right? The other's beliefs are actually true. Okay. In fact, it's not only the case that the other's beliefs are actually true. The other person, the second person, actually seems to be a model of rationality according to many theories of what it is to be rational. Right, one thing we often say about being rational is we say, well, you have to come to conclusions based on evidence. Well, that's exactly what this person is doing. He's collecting evidence. He's collecting evidence in a very scientific way. He's weighing the evidence and he's drawing the right conclusions from it. So that seems extremely rational. You might think, okay, but isn't it a bit strange to sort of search out evidence for the hypothesis that people are trying to poison you? But, actually a lot of people thinking about science, for instance, have said that that is exactly the kind of stuff that we ought to do, right? We ought to come up with a bold hypothesis. Well, this is a very bold hypothesis. And then we're going to try and disprove it, right? We're going to try to search out evidence that might show that it's false. Well, that's exactly what this person is doing. So, according to a lot of standard accounts of scientific methodology, this person is doing the exact right thing and should be a champion of rationality. And yet, if somebody believes that I don't want to poison him because they have looked at my secret diaries and they didn't find any evidence for a poisoning wish. Or if somebody believes that the people in the restaurant don't want to poison him because he has chemically tested the glass of Merlot wine, that doesn't seem rational at all. In fact, it seems crazy. Well, that brings me to the ideas of Raimond Gaita, an Australian philosopher, about rationality, the unthinkable, and sound judgment. And here I'm basing myself on a chapter in Gaita's book, A Common Humanity. It's a wide-ranging book. It has a lot of ethical concerns, but I'm going to focus on this very precise epistemological issue that he's talking about. And so what Gaita is telling us, he says, look, sanity, right, being sane, being not crazy or mad like the two people I've just been talking about, it requires us to leave certain things out of consideration, right? Sanity requires you to leave out of consideration the possibility that people in the restaurant are trying to poison you. Usually. I guess it's a little bit different. I mean, there could be circumstances where sanity requires you to take this seriously if you've just seen the cook open a bottle of cyanide and put it in the food. Okay, you can reconsider, right? But normally, being a sane person entails that you don't even entertain the hypothesis that the people in the restaurant might be trying to poison you. So, what Gaita is telling us is this. He says, look, it can't be the case that for everything that for every hypothesis that you could think up, we need to follow the standard procedures of rationality, where we try to get evidence and reason about something and then find out whether it's true or false. No, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of approaching the world are actually the conditions that make it possible to think about stuff like assessing evidence, doing research, and so on at all. So, let me say that again. One way of thinking, which Gaita rejects, is saying, look, okay, there are these methods, like doing research, collecting evidence, drawing conclusions, and they apply to everything. And Gaita thinks that that can't be right. Because he says, look, there are certain things that form the conditions of possibility for even engaging in these activities. Right? If you don't have certain convictions, if you don't, for instance, maybe trust your community in certain ways, then you can't even do something like research or assessing evidence or collecting evidence and so on. So, suppose that I'm a scientist, and suppose I say I'm going to apply the scientific method to everything. And then I say, look, first thing I'm going to apply the scientific method to is this question. Maybe, this is my hypothesis, maybe all scientists of the past were blatant liars. Right? Maybe they never did any of the research that they did. They didn't make any of the observations they claimed they made. Maybe they were all blatant liars. That's what I'm going to investigate. Well, if you want to try to investigate that, you first have to throw out all science. Right? But if you throw out all science, you have nothing left to work with. At least nothing left that is recognizable as doing something in modern science. But I could be actually a lot more radical than that, right? Suppose if I say, oh look, the first thing I want to investigate is whether maybe my senses always deceive me, right? The first thing I'm going to investigate is whether my senses, maybe, like my eyes, my ears and so on, always deceive me and show me the world completely differently than it actually is. And now it becomes really unclear how anything that I could do to test that hypothesis still counts as testing that hypothesis. right? If I'm not willing to rely on my own sensation, is there anything left that could be called finding evidence, assessing that evidence and drawing a conclusion? Is there anything left that could be called rational investigation? That seems very unclear. Or what if I go make it even stronger, right? And I say, oh, look, what the hypothesis I want to test is the hypothesis that there isn't an external world at all, right? We're being deceived by an evil demon. That's the hypothesis that I want to test. Again, if I do that, it becomes extremely unclear whether there's anything left that could be called rational investigation. So, that is Gaita's basic contention. That there are certain things that you just have to take for granted. Because if you don't take them for granted, the structure that is needed for something like rational investigation to even exist isn't there. This is an extremely anti-Cartesian point, right? Anti-Cartesian, anti-René Descartes, the famous 17th century philosopher. What René Descartes believes, or what he claims at least to do in his book The Meditations on First Philosophy, is he says, look, I'm going to doubt everything, right? I'm going to doubt everything. I'm going to doubt whether there is an external world. I'm going to doubt whether my senses tell me anything that's true, and so on. I'm going to doubt what all the scientists of the past have told me. I'm going to doubt all that. And then I'm going to start a rational investigation in order to find out what I can trust, right? I'm going to rationally investigate whether I can trust that there's an external world, whether I can believe that, whether I can know that. I'm going to rationally investigate whether I can trust my senses, and so on. And what Gaita is telling us that Descartes is making a fundamental mistake here. Because Descartes doesn't consider whether doubting everything leaves us with the resources that allow us to engage in rational investigation at all. Right? And his claim, of course, is that it doesn't. Right? If you doubt everything, if you manage to doubt everything, he actually doesn't think that Descartes succeeded or that anyone could succeed at that. But if you were to manage doubting everything, you would no longer be someone who could investigate anything. Because any kind of investigation is going to require participation in a practice that requires us to take a lot of things for granted. Right? A practice that requires us to take certain ways of collecting evidence for granted. A practice that takes certain ways of reasoning for granted, and so on. You can't throw all of that away and still claim that you are participating in the practice of rational investigation. So here's a quote from Gaita. This is page 173 in his book A Common Humanity. What he writes is this. He says, the certainty expressed when we rule things out of consideration is cognitively more interesting than a psychological state and more basic than a rationally supported belief. So I'm going to say that again. The certainty expressed when we rule things out of consideration, right? Certain things we rule out of consideration. I don't even consider whether people are trying to poison me. I don't even consider whether my senses might be deceiving me. I don't even consider whether there could be an evil demon who is faking the entire world around me. Well, the certainty expressed when I, rule things out of consideration it's two things. It's cognitively more interesting than a psychological state. So it's not just some psychological phenomenon, right? It's not just that I can't take the evil demon seriously. I've tried to, but my psychology doesn't allow me to do that. No, I mean, this is something that is epistemologically, that is philosophically interesting, right? My refusal to take seriously these bizarre scenarios are epistemologically interesting. They play a role that as a philosopher I should take seriously. And here we find why I should take them seriously as a philosopher. they are more basic than a rationally supported belief. So I first need this situation in which I rule certain things out of consideration before there can even be things like rationally supported beliefs. Okay, let's try to make that a little bit more concrete by looking at this first figure I introduced, this paranoid person who believes that everybody is out there to poison him. It's a fairly well-known, and I don't know whether it's universal, but it's a fairly well-known phenomenon that paranoid people can be, in a certain way, extremely rational, right? They can be extremely good at reasoning. So maybe I talk to this person who thinks that everybody is out there to poison them. And I say, look, I mean, of course not. Why would people want to poison you, right? And they say, they want to poison me because the CIA has put $10 million on my head as a reward. Well, there's something rational in this, right? I mean, I have an objection. I say, look, I mean, people wouldn't want to poison you. And they say, people would want to poison me because they'll get $10 million if they manage to poison me. And of course, then I say, look, but of course not. I mean, why would the CIA put $10 million on your head? I mean, you're just a random person. And then the paranoid person is going to say, no, that's because I am, and I don't know what kind of hypothesis, but they have some kind of belief, right? Some kind of belief that fits this story. And if I ask them where they get that belief, they're going to tell me about their evidence, right? They're going to tell me about what they have seen and experienced that is evidence for this belief. And although at each stage, right, their evidence maybe doesn't make a lot of sense to me, or maybe I want to interpret it differently, internally, the story of the paranoid person can be extremely coherent, right? Given all the other things that the paranoid person believes, their reasoning might even be impeccable. It might be perfect, right? Given all the things that they believe, these interpretations of what they have experienced make sense. And if you have those interpretations, then these conclusions make sense, and so on. So internally speaking, all the steps of rational argumentation are actually being followed. And so what Gaita tells us is that, look at what happens to the concept of evidence in the hands of such a paranoid person. Right? It becomes a kind of persiflage of itself. Right? You can sort of use it. You can go through all the motions, and internally it looks perfect. But because you didn't rule the right things out of consideration, because you're not trusting the right things, you're not really engaged in rational thought. Right? And all the evidence is not really evidence. And all the reasoning is not really reasoning. And so what Gaita tells us is that in order for evidence to be evidence, in order for reasoning to be reasoning, in order for rationality to be rationality, in order for knowledge to be knowledge and belief to be belief and so on, in order for all these concepts to function in the right way, you need a context. And that's a context in which certain things are ruled out of consideration from the outset. Or, to frame it more positively, it's a context in which certain things are trusted. Right? We trust our senses. We trust our community. We trust in many ways, right? We trust that our parents have told us, as far as was possible for them, the truth about the world. We trust that the people who taught us language taught it right? We trust that there was not a conspiracy of people who always said cow to us when they should have said lion, and lion when they should have said cow, right? We trust that. If we didn't trust that, we wouldn't really be able to use language to communicate with people. We trust our senses. We trust that when we ask people their names, they tell us their names, right? We trust all these things all the time. And if we don't do that, if we sort of radically let go of that trust, not in maybe one or two small things, but if we in large swathes of that drop our trust, then our very ability to participate in rational practices, our very ability to collect evidence, to weigh evidence, to draw conclusions is impaired, right? We can no longer do that. We are like the paranoid person who goes through the motions of reasoning, but isn't actually reasoning, who goes through the motions of evidence, but doesn't actually have evidence, and so on. And so what Gaita tells us, it's a phrase that I really like. He tells us that we must trust if we are to believe. And you should take that completely literally. If we are to believe, if we are to have any beliefs at all, right? If we are to make any moves in this game of rational thinking, in this practice of rational thinking, we have to trust. There's a lot probably that we have to trust before we can even have any bona fide beliefs. So that's the story that Gaita is telling, and as I've said, it's a very anti-Cartesian story. It really goes against the way that Descartes thinks that thinking works and that evidence works and that we can get to knowledge. And in fact, it seems to me an extremely promising strategy in getting rid of skepticism, right? Because the skeptic is somebody who says, no, you should start from doubt, right? You can't start from trust. That's irrational, right? Trusting is irrational. We need evidence. And what Gaita is suggesting to us is that, look, that makes no sense. Without trust, there couldn't even be such a thing like evidence. And again, I think that's a very promising move to make against anyone who tries to give you a sort of skeptical story about knowledge.